Hi folks, this is Jay. Hope you're okay today. It's good to be with you. Um, we're just looking at the question about slavery in the Bible. The information that I'm getting from material, and it's called ChristianThinkTank.com. ChristianThinkTank.com, and it's on slavery. So if you type in ChristianThinkTank.com, slavery, you'll be able to access this information. And I'm just going to read a little bit about the writer, what he says. He says, the specific case of slavery is more complex than first appears. There is no monolithic institution of slavery in the Bible. E.g., the Old Testament has several models of what might be called slavery, and much of what is passed as slavery in the A&E, ancient Near East, is no longer considered such in socio-economic understandings of the period and area. In the New Testament case, the problem is usually complicated by the seeming position that all socio-economic that can be either used wonderfully or abused woefully. For example, I am called to be a slave of Christ and to obey within the conscience and stewardship the demands of oppressive governments. This area of cultural forms is notoriously difficult, in my opinion, so the Philemon situation is not at all decisive or instructive for me. I am familiar, however, with those Civil War debates, but consider much of that simply bad theological method. Simply put, I think the problem is more complex than a simple Paul hedged here. I am still thinking through this, so don't take my comments as finished goods. And hence I want to come back to the issue in this series. So he goes into an in-depth analysis of this topic, and he's a very good writer and very, very well researched. I'm a child of West Record South. The word slavery is such a powerful vortex of images, meanings, cries, and grief to me. Any technical discussion of any type of forced labor or corvée becomes immediately inflamed with the word slavery is attached to it, and I suspect that many others share this association. That's why I think the atheists use the word a lot against the Bible. It's a very powerful emotive word, and they think they can win an argument by just using it. Just an aside, those atheists who use the word slavery against the Bible, how do you get out of the naturalist fallacy? How do you get out of the is-ought distinction? Just on the issue of morality, just a little thing there. But anyhow, he writes, scholars in the A&E have often abandoned the use of the general term slavery in descriptions of the many diverse forms of master-servant that are manifest in the ancient world. There are very few true slave societies in the world, with Rome Greek being two of the major ones, and ancient Israel will be seen to be outside this classification as well, in legislation, not practice. A recent example of this comes from the discussion of the Hittite culture. Guttebok he quotes, Butterbuk refers to slaves in the strict sense, apparently referring to chattel slaves such as those of classical antiquity. This characterization may have been valid for house slaves whose masters could treat them as he wished them when they were at fault, but it is less suitable when they were capable of owning property and could pay betrothal money or fines. The meaning servant seems more appropriate, and perhaps the designation semi-free. It comprises every person who is subject to orders or dependent on another, but nonetheless has certain independence within his own sphere of activity. Scholars in cultural anthropology are sensitive to this as well, writes the Christian think tank. Slavery was quite unique historically. Quote, scholars do not agree on a definition of slavery. The term has been used at various times for a wide range of institutions, including plantation slavery, forced labor, the drudgery of factories, sweet shops, child labor, semi-voluntary prostitution, bride price marriage, child adoption for payment, and paid for surrogate motherhood. Somewhere within this range, the literal meaning of slavery shifts into metaphorical meaning, but it is not entirely clear at what point. A similar problem arises when we look at other cultures. The reason is that the term slavery is evocative rather than analytical, calling to mind a loose bundle of diagnosed features. These features are mainly derived from the most recent direct Western experiences within slavery, that of the southern United States, the Caribbean and Latin America. The present Western image is haphazardly constructed out of the representations of that experience in 19th century abolitionist literature, later novels, textbooks and films, from a global cross-cultural and historical perspective. However, New World slavery was a unique conjunction of features. In brief, most varieties of slavery did not exhibit the three elements that were dominant in the New World: slaves as property and commodities, their use exclusively as labor, and their lack of freedom. End of quote. He says, generally in the A&E, these fuzzy boundaries obtained as well. Slavery is a very relative word in our time period, and we have to be very careful into auto-associating it with more vivid New World examples. For example, in the West, we would never say that the American president's cabinet were his slaves, but this term would have been applied to them in the A&E kingdoms, and as in the A&E, even though children and family could be bought and sold, they were never. The property aspect for such transactions did not define explicit notion of slavery. Quote, freedom in the ancient Near East was a relative, not an absolute state, as the ambiguity of the term for slave in all the regions' language illustrates. Slave could be used to refer to a subordinate in the social ladder. Thus the subjects of a king were called his slaves, even though they were free citizens. The king himself, if a vassal, was the slave of his emperor. Kings, emperors, commoners alike were slaves of the gods. Even a social inferior, when addressing a social superior, referred to himself out of the politeness as your slave. There were, moreover, a plethora of servile conditions that were not regarded as slavery, such as son, daughter, wife, serf, human, pledge, etc. So I'm going to leave it there. Type in ChristianThinkTank.com slavery. This article was created December 30th, 1999, updated on March 18, 2004. It's on Christian Think Tank. The title is, Does God Condone Slavery in the Bible? I'm going to discuss what he says in a minute. I've only read a few paragraphs of what he said and the scholars that he's quoted. So I'm just going to, if you type in Peter Williams, Dr. Peter Williams, lecture on the Old Testament in YouTube, he will give also a good expounding of the word slavery in his lecture on the Old Testament. So type in Dr. Peter Williams on the Old Testament. He's a scholar who's been resident at Tyndale House, and he's done a great lecture on slavery. He's an expert. Also, there's a book by Dr. Barnes on slavery. If you go to Google Archive Books and you type in slavery by Dr. Barnes, you will find, or Albert Barnes, slavery. You'll find about a 300-page book that goes into a massive exposition of what the Bible teaches. So that will really help you if you really want to think about the subject. Have a look at Albert Barnes on slavery, Google Book Archive. You can get the book PDF, read it, it will really help you. Have a look at Dr. Peter Williams' lecture on the Old Testament. He's an authority on this subject, and what he says will be a real help to you. Okay? And don't forget to have a look at this very helpful, informative article on ChristianThinkTank.com on slavery. Okay? So there's two points that I want to make here that are very important. When you get these internet atheists saying, oh, the Bible teaches slavery, two points to be made. Number one, their exegesis of the Bible is a joke. They haven't got any real great Bible scholars amongst the atheists in the atheist world. I know I've challenged them to debates. They won't debate me. So, you know, they don't know how to do exegesis. They don't know how to study the Bible. If you study the Old Testament and the New Testament on what slavery is in the Bible, you'll find that there's about 6 or 7 different ideas of it. And you'll find a whole variety of teaching on slavery in the Old Testament, for example. You'll not find one particular model. You'll not find buy a slave, keep them for life, beat them, and that's it. You won't find anything like that. What you'll find is a very complex and a very rich, diverse rules and regulations about having what I would call servants. These people were not slaves as we think they're slaves. These people had rights. If you look at the Old Testament, anybody working for a family for whatever reason had rights. They had the right, for example, them unfairly to leave and run away. They had that right. So that alone, just that one thought alone, shows you're not dealing with the same understanding of slavery as, say, the American Civil War, where the slave was bought and beat and whatever. It is a completely different understanding in what the Bible's teaching. And the atheists will say, oh, no, it's slavery, but do your exegesis. Go and get a Bible, go and look at the commentaries, go and study what the Old Testament says as a whole, and you'll be quite surprised and amazed, because the people who were taken into families for whatever reason, they had rights. Yeah. Secondly, the way to undermine slavery in the Bible is through the cross and not politics. In fact, in the book of Philemon, Paul says to the owner of the slave, when he sends him, when Paul sends him back, he says, treat him like you would treat me. So slavery is undermined by Christianity getting to treat the individual as you would be treated. The way Christ dealt with us, he sacrificed himself for us. So whether you're a slave or whether you're a slave owner, you are to sacrifice yourself for the other person, to care for the other person. So Paul undermined slavery in the ancient Roman world by trying to get the slave owner to see the need to love the slave as himself, and the slave love the owner as the self. And if that's by de facto, no slavery. So that's how the New Testament undermines slavery, not by politics, but by the cross. Yeah. So in the Old Testament, there's a variety of understandings of what slavery is. It's not the same kind of slavery